Hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report, and hopefully we have the audio issues figured out this time. We just spent about 20 minutes trying to iron out those issues, so without further ado, let's get right into our news in Syria. Here's our map in Syria, and of course, more of the same. It's really seemed to calm down because the focus, in terms of at least Turkey, has moved to Libya, which we will be discussing in a few minutes here. But big news is there were allegedly Israeli strikes that traveled through southern Lebanon and hit targets in Israel. Idlib is calm. Of course, the resurgence of ISIS, the more assassinations of officials, and as we discussed last week, the implementation of sanctions, which, as of yet, it doesn't seem like it's put that much of a strain on the Syrian economy, not more than there already was. But as is with sanctions, it usually takes a little bit for them to kick in. You'll recall with the situation in Iran, there was a 6 month grace period before these sanctions were reinstituted, and then it took even a few months after that, to the point where it was like a year after exiting the Iran deal is when we really started to see the sanctions in Iran take effect. And that would have been around May 2019, which we saw the uh, tanker wars and the blowing up of oil tankers and the seizing of oil tankers, which there is potential for that to break out again. There have been uh, discussions about that with Venezuela, and Venezuela is another topic we'll be covering in brief today because there's been some things going on with that in Latin America and American policy towards there. And uh, again, we'll also get into that because I do want to dedicate a bit of a segment to John Bolton's return to the spotlight. But again, we'll get to that probably towards the end of the show. But Syria is, like I said, probably the calmest. It's the calmest a country in a civil war can be, all things considered, with every other global event going on currently. Like I said, I haven't heard any new news out of Idlib beyond some joint patrols, some bombings, the usual stuff. No real news out of the Kurdish zone, even with Turkey. Even though Turkey has been conducting operations in Iraq, mainly bombing minority villages, I believe. It's led to an interesting dynamic because the Kurds say this is an operation against us. This is Turkey just trying to wipe us off map again. Even though when you look at northern Iraq, they're mostly bombing these historical Assyrian villages. So it gets into that muddled mess. And the point I'm getting at is Turkey has mainly shifted its focus from Syria to Iraq and especially Libya. But just to cover the Syrian news now, it's almost newsworthy that there's so little news about it.
Right, other than, the usual infighting between HTS and Fa'it Batu. This is a kind of a new organization and the Turkmen Liberation Army. So basically what happened the last 2 days is HTS, Harir Sham, raided their headquarters and sort of brought them into line. But yeah, they'll assassinate a few people, kind of like what we've been covering really the last month. That's what's been going on. There was a raid in southern Idlib where Russian special forces took out seven of the jihadi operatives, and now the jihadi operatives are claiming that two Russians were killed, but there's no proof is given, and the Syrian government is denying any of it is true. I suppose that's really just to keep kind of like faith in the Idlib experiment to continue. But generally speaking, except for the Israeli strikes, which did cost the lives of two Syrian soldiers, there isn't that much in the north. Again, the same games. The Russian patrol outmaneuvered and sped past the American patrol, and another American patrol was stopped by the local Syrian army. So it's kind of like really more in the same, as you say. It's just is not quite as active as they were in May. But yeah, most of the news really right now really also on a global scale is happening in Libya.
I'm just curious since you brought it up. What's the ETA on HTS, whatever, changing the name of Idlib to the Northern Syrian Autonomous Zone?
They don't have a Raz yet. Once they do, then that's when the name switch is going to be.
I the thing is they consistently have their own razzes. They all just get assassinated by each other. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, it's
that's
actually
true.
it's very fitting. The parallels are uncanny. Believe it or not, just that we don't know. I suppose we do know the state backers behind the Chaz, behind the Chop, behind the whatever. Perhaps the Northern Syrian occupied zone. Even though that sounds something like something more sinister, something that Turkey would establish, like that little sliver in Kurdish territory. But I mean, we've already seen just to get not to get off too much of a tangent. The one Islamic group made a mural to George Floyd, and then the other one destroyed it, and then they tried to blame the Syrian government. it was an ordeal, and it's interesting watching these Islamic terrorist groups appeal to Western liberalism because they're in such a desperate state that like. Please, Mr. Trump, bail us out. Please,
Yeah,
please, Mrs. Pelosi, impeach Blump so we can get a Democratic president to save us from Putler and Assad's gas attacks, but it's it's
yeah.
it's it's all very very absurd. Now, I do want to discuss further on Syria because, like I said, it's a rather slow news week in Syria, which I know is a surprise. Of course, we get the perpetual chase of patrols. Americans getting chased around Syria, which again definitely helps our credibility, and we definitely would take so much more of a blow if we just withdrew instead of being chased around, what on a daily basis at this point. But I'm really still trying to figure out these sanctions because we touched on them last week. We haven't gotten much news about them. This also comes with last week, I didn't cover this. Assad purging several members of his government, including the prime minister, sort of doing just a clean sweep. Now, that could be under pressure from Russia, as they discussed, even though I doubt it. It could be just transitioning into either a new phase of the war or towards a more post-war administration. You don't necessarily want the people you have fighting a civil war governing the country in a time of relative peace, I'll say. But you have all of that, and I'm also wondering how many of those officials that were fired were actually sanctioned themselves. And I mean, I know with the
Hmm.
conduct of American foreign policy, even if Assad did fire them, it would make no difference. I mean, Putin completely gutted his government, and yet there are still sanctions on Russia and Russian officials. So they'll find a way to work around if they really want to put sanctions on you. But I'm trying to figure out, like I said, it's early on. We don't know how severe these will be. Is this really a thing? This is like, oh, we're in the perfect position to crush Assad, or is this just a we're doing something sort of action so they can maintain their quote unquote credibility?
Well, I mean, if anything, I think Iran is the country that can teach them how to avoid the impacts of American sanctions, right? Because I mean, that's one of the enduring things about Iran is that their revolution has managed to like evade kind of the problem with a lot of counter revolutions where they go back to the status quo. They think they can trust their institutions again and so on. And, instead what happens with them is like their ideology fills up everything, right? And, to a Westerner, that's very authoritarian or whatever, but it works for them. And, they won't tolerate everything had to be wiped clean. So they did actually have a revolution, much to the chagrin of like Anglo Zionists who uh, were crazy about the Shah and so on. So I suppose in some ways you're right. An immediate effect of Assad getting some of the people in his cabinet removed is possibly to avoid sanctions in a certain sense by filling them up with new people, and then the Americans have to come up with more sanctions, which have to go through the same process. On the other hand, it could also be that he might be thinking that as sanctions increase, there's certain people in his cabinet that can't be trusted. So that's my guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most logical take on this. And what I'm hoping for is, I think these sanctions are ridiculous. I think they're accomplishing nothing from even an American empire sort of standpoint, and even a standpoint if you believe that it's our moral obligation to be this vanguard around the world. I don't see how it's accomplishing that, but again, to put aside those devil's advocate sort of arguments, what I'm hoping comes out of this is some sort of, I don't want to say hasty, but a quicker peace agreement, because, again, they were on the brink of that. They'd been discussing it with the Kurdish groups. Of course, we saw the establishment of the joint patrols in Idlib. Even though with Turkey all but cutting its losses in Syria and even turning on some of the groups it previously backed, we may
Yeah.
see where that's not necessary, and to the point where, I mean, Turkish support has been moved to Libya to great success, as I'll show you in a minute on the map there. Uh, it's been moved to great success, and I'm curious to see how long a lot of these groups can last without a steady stream of Turkish support. And if so, is there any other outside support? Is there, I mean, the main thoughts are American, British, probably not so much French at this point, Israeli, even though Israeli, it's probably not getting through to Idlib, but again, if there's will, there's way, and especially with Israeli intelligence operations, they probably have connections within Turkey or connections within wherever that could smuggle those sort of weapons in. But from what I've seen, which again is a very limited view, we all have a very limited view of what's actually going on with these sort of things, I think Turkey's probably the primary backer, and whatever other assistance they get is negligible, especially with the evacuation of the White Helmets, as you recall, about a year and a half ago. That was pretty much the Americans and the British cutting their losses in Syria. Now, of course, they'll still do things like the sanctions, they'll threaten military force, but in terms of a sustained campaign against Assad's government, I think that has come mostly to an end on the Anglo-American end, and I'm still, like I said, I'm still curious to see how long HTS and whatever
Mm-hmm.
acronym group,
Mm-hmm.
whatever alphabet soup group can last without a steady stream of support from a foreign power, especially foreign power right on the border.
Well, I mean, I saw two videos this week from CSIS, and they had a rather long video with a gentleman named Sullivan who was being interviewed, and this was this interview was basically about John Alterman was interviewing Jake Sullivan, and it was basically about how America has to change its strategy for the Middle East. And this is hilarious because on the one hand, they kind of admit that Obama was more right than wrong, but the JPCOA, for instance, was wrong not in spirit but in execution. What they should have had were local players who decided on it, like like Iran was going to agree with Israel and Saudi Arabia having a voice.
I'm sure the UAE would have been a very sympathetic partner for the Iranians. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, them too, right? So um, they really didn't have, they kept stressing that, it's about building stronger relationships. It was one of the most desperate things I'd ever heard, to be perfectly frank. They brought up, this was before Duda's visit to the U.S. So they discussed, where troops might be relocated, but that troop increasement should not be looked at necessarily as a positive. That dialogue was more important. I mean, I think basically the American establishment has been well aware that uh, even dialogue is no longer credible anymore. after the Iraq War. In a way, it's done with. Um, it doesn't mean there isn't such a thing as American pressure, but what they are outlining, even in very coded language, is something else. They're really trying to flip this situation by other means that have already been used, particularly the military, right, with direct involvement. And then there was another CSIS video that was complaining about how effective Russia has been in all its goals in the last 5, 6 years, beginning with Maidan. So, like, it is a slow slugging match, and we're probably not going to get, the Syria restored that we wanted to, um, but it will. It's more functional now than it was 5 years ago, which was really like on the brink of just becoming another Libya. So I just wanted to say that. Also, ISIS took out ISIS took out Colonel Bakar, who was a Syrian army officer who defected in 2012 for the Free Syrian Army. I can't remember whether it was the Pentagon or the CIA that funded his sort of I don't know, brigade or fighters. But so ISIS claims responsibility that they took him out. Just it's so convoluted.
Oh,
But
of course, the the,
that's
the,
all I
the, the
that's all I had to say.
the brave supporter of the new revolutionary movement. Yeah, I mean, it's like Catalonia, but funnier.
And smaller.
Yeah, and smaller, and surprisingly enough, not as gay. Um, which, again, I suppose maybe that has to do with the Islam thing, but who knows? Whatever. But that point aside, I mean, you make a point about, yeah, Syria is not going to be the unitary sort of state it was under an autocratic leadership that it was pre-war, and there were arguably flaws with that system. Now, I think it probably worked better than any other alternatives they had in front of them, but yeah, in the future, and you even see Russia hinting towards this, and to a lesser degree Iran, especially Turkey, a more federalized Syria, one that where the power is more decentralized, where you could influence factions. I would say, in theory, what people thought post Saddam Iraq was going to be. Now, of course, there were other factions at play there that arguably wanted a destabilization of that country, but it quite a bit of the players that actually have a say in Syria's future do have an interest in stabilization, like I said, like Iran, like Russia. Arguably, even Turkey wants a degree of stabilization in Syria, but they want, of course, their groups to have influence. So it's going to be a more pluralistic state, for better or for worse, but as you said, at least it's not another Libya, which brings us into the big topic of the day.
Mm.
Oh boy, I'm excited for this one. So remember last time we looked at that map? Of course, you can't see this, but our audience will be able to. How small that little blue chunk was. Look at how much that has increased. They control the north. Let's see. That's northwest corner of the entire country, except that little pocket in there. When before they weren't, the Haftar's forces were on the brink of taking back Tripoli, the LNA, and yeah, the GNA is expanding. That is the power of Turkish support right there. And then that's on top of the Egyptian invasion, which just occurred about a week and a half ago, in support of the LNA, in support of Haftar's forces, who also has support from France, from Russia. Turkey is the only side that really supports the GNA, and I'm not even sure if the GNA has a leader in the same way you'd consider Haftar a leader of the LNA. I don't know who really the face of their movement is. I think that goes to speak for a lot of it. The United States tentatively supports the GNA, even though it has done really nothing to support it materially. In fact, we withdrew our troops from Libya about 13, 14 months ago. Again, one thing I give Trump actually a lot of credit on, because that very well could have become Benghazi 2.0 in terms of American loss of life over such a senseless conflict. I think the British have made tentatively pro GNA, pro Turkish statements. I know they did in Syria a few months ago, and given Boris Johnson's ancestry, perhaps he has a bit of a a bit of a sympathy for his ancestral homeland, if you know what I mean. But so, ain't that something? The Anglo nation led by the part Turkish guy, standing in for the historical Anglo-Turkish alliance. But okay, beyond that, what we have here is, again, Turkey dedicating massive amounts of resources, which you can see the fruits of right here, and going even as far as, according to the French at least, if you believe what the French have to say, threatening to shoot down French aircraft or providing the GNA with the resources to down French aircraft. And the main dispute has been between France and Turkey. Now, previously it was between Russia and Turkey. It seems like there's been more of an understanding, or at least a standstill when it comes to those negotiations, those talks, that situation. But this has gone as far as to lead the French to call into question the European Union relationship with Turkey. So, a lot is unfolding in Libya. We're probably going to see it heat up after about a year long. I would say we're actually approaching a year and 2 months, about 14-month stalemate in Libya. And what we have is two secondary powers. Now, I would say objectively, France pulls more weight on the world stage, considering its nuclear arsenal, considering its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, all these other factors taken into consideration. But what we have with that is a country that is the second largest military in NATO, well funded, clearly competent, as we've seen in Libya. Now, maybe not so much in Syria with its operations there, but I don't know, maybe Libya is more favorable conditions for them. Again, these things, there's a multitude of different factors you can take into consideration. But France, who admittedly under Sarkozy played a role in the destruction of Libya, and now under Macron wants to spearhead the reconstruction of Libya, even going as far as to ally with countries as disparate as Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states to a degree. That's a very important distinction. But again, there's been some tendencies in the Gulf states to play both sides of the conflict, which is no surprise. Hell, I think Israel is even more sympathetic to Haftar and the LNA force at this point. Now, I could be wrong, but I think I saw something that at least hinted at that. I don't know if they've taken an official position on the conflict, but it looks like, the main dispute right now is between France and Turkey, which it's definitely going to be interesting with the sort of new, I guess, say, more independent role France has taken in global politics on the world stage with its foreign policy. So, I think we're in for, lack of a better word, interesting times in Libya.
Yeah, I think oil definitely comes into this for France. I don't know probably what kind of deal they have with Haftar or in a future Libya. The other thing there's two other things I'd like to bring up, and that's Turkey has this idea, about their relationship to Libya prior to the destruction of Libya and how they would like to restore that. And second of all, there's lots of Turks who agree with that, by the way, and they think France has no say in Libya, and neither does NATO after 2011. Furthermore, I think there's also this kind of quasi-political, quasi-religious ideology that Erdogan has definitely nurtured. You could see in 2016 when the coup against him failed, he basically called on all those people who came from Anatolia to the European side of Constantinople, to the European side of Turkey in Istanbul.
I was about to say, don't say it, but you did. Too late for that. It's gone. The moment's over. You had it and you lost it. But continue.
Yes. So, and that foiled that. But it's fair to say that not all of his military was on board with ousting him. In any case, so he's been nurturing that, and I think that different countries have different reasons why they fear Turkey's influence and involvement in Libya as well as other places in the Middle East. I'm willing to bet that even Israel, who's very quiet right now, is kind of worried about where Turkey could go in the future. And like you say, you have a very diverse group of actors from Saudi Arabia to France to Russia in agreement. And basically, you also have Italy, France, and Germany who have said that they will work in unison in the EU to address the situation in Libya, and particularly with the GNA. So um, this struggle, which I don't know, was sort of like under the radar for the last few years, has really become the prominent hotspot. And you could see with the failure of the LNA to take the rest of the country, and then now it's on the brink of losing Citra. And so what you have Egypt also as well threatening that they're going to invade if this happens. There's other countries in North Africa that are also afraid of the success of the GNA and the success of Turkey. So shades of Ottoman Empire being challenged again. You have some countries on board with it and look at Turkey as a leader, but you have most who don't. And this is causing, I think, major cracks in NATO right now. Like Turkey's worth in NATO is basically what its original purpose was in the inclusion in NATO in the first place, and that is to be a counter to Russia. And this is why, like, I think a lot of Westerners who are basically thinking how we're going to save the West, they're always uh, uh, unclear, uncertain, why is Turkey even in NATO, and I always found that so naive.
Yeah, and
But
I mean, asking why Turkey is in NATO is calling into question the entire existence of NATO, which a lot of it seems to become a more. It was weird, like early Trump, pre-Trump. Why does NATO exist? The sort of Ron Paul point of view was very popular. Under Trump, when Trump was going to make NATO pay their fair share, people were pacified. But as time goes on, around 2019, 2020, people are yet again calling into question the existence of NATO, which I think is a position we have consistently taken. That it's no longer 1982. Why is NATO still in existence? Why do we need this coalition of disparate European nations cooperating towards this one very vague goal? Now they're trying to reorient it to counterterrorism operations or Chinese expansion, which, I mean, even if you're concerned about Chinese expansion in Europe, it's not something that's going to be countered by a military alliance. Most of their expansion to Europe is economic and media, but again, that's a topic for a different day. But it Turkey, as you were saying, it's become a real wild card to the point where they're the ones, they're the sole group supporting the Muslim Brotherhood faction in Libya, which is the GNA is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is why Egypt is so stridently against it, which is why a lot of the Gulf states are so stridently against it. I mean, Egypt, you'd think, oh, Muslim Brotherhood, of course they're going to support it.
right,
Not since Al Sisi's coup. I mean, I think it was Mohammed Morsi was the president that was like one of their leaders who got elected. He got overthrown in 2013. So Egypt, despite being the birthplace and the home to the Muslim
yeah.
Brotherhood, its government is staunchly anti-Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the actions they take, I would say, are insufficient for a government that supposedly opposes it. Now, I think, again, I also don't think Sisi, the current president, the quasi-military dictator of Egypt right now, I don't know his personal opinions on it. You rarely know a politician's personal opinion on it, but I think he views them as more of a threat to his power and would ally with them if he could get away with it and if it was convenient for him. But right now, the Muslim Brotherhood has, especially after the Arab Spring, has such a stain on it, such a bad reputation that it is nothing you want to touch, and to the point where only a country like Turkey would take up its cause and ally themselves with it.
Right, and you can see that there's a shift that's happening, and it's not just happening, say, in Eastern Europe, but you can see that the same shift is happening in Turkey and has been going on for almost a decade now. those feminist marches that you saw in Istanbul, they're not quite as frequent. They're also, the government cracks down on them much harder, but also Erdogan's government was always in favor of bringing the more conservative elements from Anatolia into Istanbul, and that's really like the key ingredient in this new kind of ideology he's forging. And the whole Ataturk secularism, um, that comes from a kind of idea of remaking Turkey after it had already been diagnosed as a so-called sick man of Europe, right? So I would say that um, you know this is a kind of a kind of restructuring, a kind of remaking that we probably haven't seen before.
Yeah, I was actually talking about this the other day, but Turkey is a great case study for a. Now, I think it's too early to say it's successful, but it's a great case study for a semi-successful, conservative, religious, rural, political rebellion within a country.
Yeah, yeah, he's managed it. I mean, he's saved his president. They saved his presidency.
Yeah, the crowds out in the streets. I mean, because yeah, the supporters of the coup were of the Ataturk, secular Turkish Republic sort of ideal, whereas Erdogan, I almost want to parallel him to Orban, but like again, not in the praiseworthy sort of way, but in terms of the way he's managed his political career, in terms of creating, whereas Orban created Christian democracy, or more so, co-opted Christian democracy and created illiberal democracy. Erdogan is sort of making Islamic democracy his own thing. He doesn't necessarily want to return to the Sultan, to the Ottoman, maybe not the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, some elements possibly, but he is forging a more conservative version of a democratic regime that is necessary for the current world order. And look, regardless of your opinions on Turkey, I know I have a low opinion on Turkey. I'm presuming you do as well, based on your previous comments. I presume most of our audience does as well. But it's really an impressive. It's an impressive feat. It's a success story. Something that I think a lot of conservative activists, maybe the Anglosphere is a bit more of a muddled situation because of political culture, but especially in Europe, I think it's something they can learn from.
I think that's a good point. So yeah, this is kind of shift because I mean, we are seeing kind of the death, and for many people it's unconscious, but the death of the global liberal order. We are witnessing it. It is kind of, if you look at the totality of it, right, with all the protests that are going on in the West and particularly in America, it doesn't ring true. I mean, it rings true for the West, but it doesn't ring true necessarily for, say South Korea, where they put some BLM poster, which really doesn't make, not that that country, isn't paused to a great degree, but it doesn't resonate the same way, and it won't resonate the same way in Japan, for instance, either. Um, but yeah, I think they're seeing the fissures. Its time is limited, and uh, I have no one. Can anyone remember Turkey acting this independently since the Cyprus War? I mean, I can't.
Yeah, and funny enough, a lot of people were thinking a coup in Turkey would have brought on this sort of thing, but lo and behold, it's the democratically elected leader, and I see that global promotion of democracy really worked out the way they were expecting it. But you know, point being is, and then you see this with some things they are moving to. I would say Islamicize a lot of historically Christian sites. So, like internal politics in Turkey, again, just to be clear, a lot of stuff I do not condone. A lot of stuff I do not agree with. Again, I'm still completely, Anatolia is rightful European clay. But again, all of that aside, it still is fascinating not only to see a resurgence of a conservative political culture within a country moving towards Westernism and liberalism. Again, we've arguably seen this in some parts of Eastern Europe. I would say Turkey especially. And then you couple that with the sort of foreign policy Turkey has pursued, which again I would say Syria probably a secondary case because the entire Western world is on board with the war in Syria. But then I think Libya is the primary case of what is unfolding right now. And again, that goes back to a lot of their energy trade, a lot of their oil trade. As you brought up the war in Cyprus, and even there hasn't been a case of this in recent weeks, but their harassments along the Greek border, their harassments along the Bulgarian border, you want to go way back, their threats to the Russians with the aircraft incident. But again, we're seeing a country I would say as second tier as Turkey starting to act like this. I mean, uh, what's to stop it from causing, for lack of a better word, a chain reaction of this sort of scale? I know I started out talking about Libya, but this is just really, I mean, Turkey is in, I, I don't know how to put it, like revolutionary times. It's one of the primary players in reforging the world order. Up there with Russia,
yeah.
up there with arguably, time will tell, but Macron's France, with Iran, with the failure of the war in Syria. Turkey, I think, is an overlooked big player in a lot of the global shifts right now.
hmm And what's interesting is, 4 or 5 years ago, there were already rumors that this was happening. You had a lot of Western think tanks that were suspecting that things were going to go this way. And this was a couple of years, these articles were published a couple of years before the coup in 2016. So obviously they had wind of it, right? And but I think also what has to be addressed is Turkey, with the case in Libya, actually has a legitimate case. One, the GNA is recognized by the UN. Two, NATO and the US and France were responsible for the destruction of Libya. Those are going to be two major hurdles for them to overcome. Turkey can play this, and if it gets really wild, and Egypt involves itself, and let's say Saudi Arabia, and Europe stays out of it, that doesn't mean that Erdogan won't see through it and then send more refugees into Europe. He's got that card now,
Oh, absolutely.
and
He's in probably
and
one of the most powerful positions, like I said, in the region right now, and arguably
oh yeah.
the entirety of Europe. I mean, like yeah, Greece and Bulgaria, they put up quite a stand and had the support of the European Union at large standing up to it. But again, it comes to a certain point, especially when Turkey is supporting the interests of, I would say, loosely the Anglo-American faction of the world in Libya. I mean, again, GNA, the UN-backed government, whatever. So there is that, and we could see something interesting. But I'm still banking on. I don't know. I think Egypt is probably going to. I think the more Turkey entrenches itself, the more Egypt's going to entrench itself, because the last thing
hmm
Egypt will want is a Muslim Brotherhood controlled Libya, even if it's just part of Libya.
Yeah, I would agree. They're afraid of the spillover, most definitely. These aren't like in many ways, the Arab countries are not as individuated as, say, European countries. So there are, sometimes from country to country, there are only mild dialectic differences between which kind of Arabic that they speak. They can easily blend one into the other. In times of history together, they were really under one governing body, under a caliphate. And that isn't the case in Europe, where every country is, it's more or less is very individuated, especially within Western Europe, even more so than Eastern Europe. But Eastern Europe is as well. And so the spillover possibility, especially with terms of like, underground movements, espionage, those are very real. And I think Egypt is rightly afraid of that, because destabilizing Egypt is not hard.
Yeah, there's more of a pan-national and civilizational identity of the Arabs than I think a lot of people give them credit for. Yes, there's a lot of Arab infighting, believe it or not, especially between the Sunni and the Shia, with the groups that are either partially or not Arab at all, however, have adopted, like, for example, like Lebanon, there's a lot of non-Arabs who speak Arabic, and again, that's getting into the question of religious, national, and civilizational identity, which I've actually wanted to make a few videos discussing, but again, that's aside the point. But especially when you get into these sort of conflicts, as we saw with the Arab Spring, spillover is very much a real thing in these sort of, I don't want to say underdeveloped countries, because especially pre-Arab Spring, a lot of these Arab countries were on the up and up. They had decent living standards, all things considered, especially compared to Africa and some parts of Asia. But once destabilization starts, especially in this region, it spreads like wildfire. Now, again, for whatever reason that is, the few things we just discussed, but yeah, I think Egypt is probably going to be at the front lines of this. We may even see direct confrontation between Egypt and Turkey in Libya, and that may be the next big conflict on the world stage. People talk about a lot of the stuff going on in East Asia, valid. People talk about a lot of things going on in Syria, valid. People talk about Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, which we're going to get into in a couple minutes here. That's very valid stuff, but I think a lot of people, after Gaddafi got knocked out, their impression of Libya is, oh, it's just an anarchic state that has open air slave markets, and they are not paying attention to a lot of the machinations going on there. Now, I'm not saying, like, oh, you should be. I'm not blaming them for overlooking it. It's actually pretty easy to overlook. I mean, how often do we discuss Libya on this show? But point being is, I think, especially as things pick up, we're going to be hearing a lot of things about Libya soon. And if I had to wager, you're going to start seeing CNN, Fox, even MSNBC, of course, the BBC and British media outlets. They're going to maybe not make an outright pro-Turkish case, but publish pieces that are sympathetic to the Turkish case in Libya. Because, again, if I'd make a wager, the Anglo-American sphere is probably going to support uh, the Turkish cause and the Muslim Brotherhood cause in Libya.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think that wraps up for Libya. Unless you have any other news items I missed there.
No, that's all I have for Libya.
Oh, fantastic! So I suppose we can move on to some Eastern European news. I have some stuff about Belarus and Russia in general, as it is Pride Month. There's very interesting machinations in Russia involving that, which I'll get into after Belarus, because Belarus is the interesting one. Now, it's been at the forefront of a sort of tug of war between the West and Russia, with focusing mainly on energy. Lukashenko has been making what you could say uncharacteristic moves compared to his past stances, and as of recently, he said a foreign plot to depose of him has been foiled. And this is, of course, ahead of the presidential election, which, of course, we know with the political state of Belarus, the election is more of a formality than an actual election than anything. And uh, some have speculated when he said a foreign plot was foiled, he was referring to something that came from Russia. And the European Union didn't really pick up on this. The European Union or NATO or the United States, which they usually do before, around, and after the Belarusian election, saying, oh, we need a more transparent election there. They've been very quiet about that lately, which leads me to believe that there is something of an alignment westward being taken. And based on what I've heard, some other sources, there is quite a bit of discontent from your average Belarusian who, again, in many cases, many of them, I think upwards like 80% of them, speak Russian as a primary language. Like, it's Ukraine on steroids in that sort of case, with how entrenched Russian culture and the Russian language is in that country. I mean, the Belarusian language is spoken by those educated in the West or Western-funded universities in Minsk, in the capital city, and beyond that, it's also spoken as like a hybrid between Belarusian and Russian, and rural areas by people who were alive before the Soviet Union existed, for a drastic example. But we're seeing things unfolding there, and maybe this is Belarus's alignment westward. Maybe Lukashenko will do the thing where he plays both sides, similar to a Turkish sort of situation, or maybe we will see popular discontent orient the country towards a more pro-Russian direction now, whether they pressure Lukashenko to return to his pro-Russian roots, or whether they, I don't know, overthrow him for, again, another drastic example. But point being is, things are heating up there. Belarus may become the front line of the new Cold War, which, again, I also have a little bit of news about Poland and Duda's visit to the United States, which, again, won't probably be the most pleasing things for the Poles if Belarus is the new buffer state. I can only imagine that wouldn't bode well for Poland's more conservative internal policy, and there'd probably be a harder push for the LGBTQ CIA stuff. That, I mean, we already see now, but I think it would kick an overdrive if Belarus were to have its own Maidan, undergo its own color revolution. I'm not saying that's in the cards just yet. I think the situation's still too new, still too volatile to determine what the hell's going on. If Lukashenko is even genuine about his orientation westward, or again whether this is just a maneuver to try to extract some concessions from Russia. But again, it's an interesting situation that's been brewing for quite some time, and it seems like it's finally starting to heat up.
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting is not 1 month after he receives like the first shipment of American gas, there's already like plans at work to depose him. It's like how many times have we seen this playbook?
Oh yeah.
I can't even believe he fell for it, or pretended to fall for it, as you might suggest. It's too, yeah, I agree with you. It's still too early. We don't know what's going to happen. He he could be playing both sides. A lot of smaller countries right now are like literally doing that, from the bigger variants like Turkey to the smaller ones like Hungary. They're going to play both sides because the bigger countries now are going through some major tectonic shifts, and this is an opportunity for them, right? Things are getting more chaotic, and opportunities arise in those situations. So it could be that Belarus is doing that. I'm not sure the Belarusian people are like, their lifestyle is nowhere nearly like the level it might be, let's say, in Ukraine. So, how popular of a movement could they garner up? I'm not so sure. The last few protests were not that big. The West made them pretty big, but they weren't. Um, so, you know, time will only tell. One thing is probably guaranteed, that that the U.S. will increase pressure on Belarus now. The hook is in, so to speak. And if he decides to remove that hook, he cannot do it without the help of Russia. So he'll have to work out some kind of a deal with them. Lukashenko, I know, said something to the effect that both sides are after me, the Russians and the, like, he's completely beleaguered. But the Russians have they've been unusually quiet about it. I'll have to say that. So maybe there is some truth to that. In any case, it's still pretty early. This would be a gem, really, for the U.S. If they could have a Maidan in Minsk. It would completely block Russia, so to speak. Now, would Russia allow it? It's pretty doubtful. So then, when is Russia going to kick into action? I'm not sure.
You gotta look at these two factors. They already have troops within the country, and it took them 5
Yeah.
days to win in a war with Georgia. And across the northern European plain, they could be in. And also imagine, I mean, Georgia much less so because virtually no Russian population, whatever. But I mean, imagine how many. They quite literally would be greeted as liberators in that case, because a lot of Belarusians just view themselves as Russians. And even worst case scenario, if a Maidan, if a color revolution did succeed, what do you think the emigration rate would be? I imagine it would be higher than Ukraine, since a lot of them, they view themselves, like I said, as completely Russian, even more so than they do in Ukraine. And with the new Russian laws on
Yeah.
immigration, I imagine Russia's just gonna open the door for them. I mean, how many of them already have family in Russia? How many of them already have ties within Russia? Whether
Well,
that,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, they have lots of Russians have a second home in Belarus anyway. So.
Yeah, I mean the countries are pretty
You
like
know, they have
they're
a cottage or a second home. So.
yeah, I mean they're very integrated as it is. Like I said, even more so than Russia and eastern Ukraine. So it's I think it's a very presumptive move to think that we can westernize Belarus, we can have another, we can help them, win their freedom and democracy. I think that's a very ignorant, maybe hubristic take from those who would want that.
Hmm. You could also, yeah, I think it's partly hubris, but I think there's also a sense of desperation. I mentioned last week that this could be also to cause Russia to make a misstep. In other words, let's say the US takes 9,000, 10,000 troops out of Germany and moves them into Poland, starts fomenting a Maidan to take place in Belarus. You have the perfect scenario, right? It would be in the interest of the West for there to be a low scale war between Poles who would look at themselves as, I don't know, maybe they would look at themselves as liberators of Belarus, um, and Russians, right? So uh, that's a possibility. That's, you know, America may not do that, but America may be investing in Russia, thinking that they will do that, right? It's there to make errors, to make hasty judgments, to take attention from some other geopolitical hotspot.
Yeah, it's
That's kind of like the way I see it now, with potential to be the hotspot within 3 years, 4 years.
yeah, it's a tripwire. It's a pretty basic trap. We've seen this before. We saw it arguably in Ukraine, but honestly, I think the best response from Russia is a propaganda campaign with inside Belarus to, again, quite literally people who are indistinguishable from Russians, even among themselves. And I think another thing they need to do is they need to preempt this before anything happens and have an open door immigration policy towards Belarus.
Hmm. Hmm.
Again, they're people are already lamenting Russia's demographic problem. I mean, even their government's talking about the need for more immigrants. Well, how about instead of Central Asian migrant workers, take in these people who would assimilate almost completely, who've probably been to Russia before, if not, or at least familiar, or probably have some familial connection. As you've said, a lot of Russians have the second home in Belarus. Like I said, it's a very integrated situation. Probably, um, it could very easily just be done like that. Now, of course, there are other factors at play here, but in comparatively to Georgia, which again was a success for Russia, all things considered, Ukraine, which was a semi-success for Russia, I'll say,
Mm.
Belarus would probably be easier than both of those if they had to take any action.
Yeah, I would say so. If they had to, maybe that's one of the reasons why the West is kind of furious that Putin will be in power till at least 2024, because he could check their moves, so to speak, um, on the chessboard. So yeah, there's that possibility. I don't think, he's not going to make a misstep. I don't think so. Um, I'm really curious as to why he's so quiet right now about Belarus. I think he's pretty sure that Lukashenko is going to fold. I think he's pretty sure Lukashenko is going to get scared that he's going to lose power in Belarus. That that might bother him more than, um, let's say, aligning himself with Russia, because of course he was there yesterday for the 75th anniversary of the Victory Parade, marking the end of World War II. The defender of the fatherland, and so on. So he was in attendance. So this could be kind of like a kind of sign that that Lukashenko has not completely given up on Russia. He may be asking for something more. Russia could, of course, given the demographic issue, they could offer possibly training for, let's say, tech jobs in Sochi, or some kind of agricultural uh, and sort of wildlife. Very flat has fairly good agriculture, but it also has lots of lakes and streams and so on. And there is, the potential for some businesses there to thrive. If more cooperation that's actually economically beneficial to both countries, if that could start to happen, I think he could keep Belarus, Putin, that is, in its sphere. But um, it sounds to me like there's really, there's systemic problems in Belarus that, of course, aligning itself with the IMF and the US will ruin it. But they seem to be at a desperate situation where they can court that. And we shouldn't forget that although the kind of the kind of hate that there are for Russians in Western Ukraine, that doesn't exist in Belarus. So yeah, it's time. Overall, it's time for solutions,
Yeah, it's especially with
and it can't just be about gas, right? Like, I mean, that is fundamental. Lukashenko wants even cheaper prices. Russia feels like we can't even go any cheaper. So something else has to be bargained upon that benefits both countries.
yeah, and again at this point it's time. This is going to be the next 4 to 6 years, the time that makes or breaks Putin. He needs to put in his final moves that he's going to make in office now because, look, there's the potential that he stays until 2032 with the constitutional referendum coming out, which I do want to discuss for a couple minutes after this. Uh, so, and it seems like he is putting things in place. We've seen it in Syria, we've seen it arguably in Iran, but now is the time, especially in Eastern Europe, on the home front, to make those final moves to secure his nation's future. And look,
Mhm.
I don't know what time will tell. I think Putin has been, at least diplomatically, a pretty good leader so far. Domestic policy, he's been a middle of the road, but he's kept Russia stable, all things considered. But now it's now or never if he wants to uh, preserve his legacy, as it were.
Mhm. Mhm.
Which again, I don't think I don't foresee him dropping the ball in these final few years. But as pressure increases, a lot of things can happen. And again, I think with our standards, our very high standards, it probably won't live up to them. But again, I don't see Russia collapsing into another Yeltsin era, barring some major event, which, as the year 2020 has shown us, major events are actually more common than you would think. But moving on to some of the constitutional referendum stuff I brought up before, uh,
Yeah.
the the vote for that is coming up soon. It's going to be decided by a popular referendum, and there's been media campaigns. Actually, the pro reform campaign, which includes a lot of things like the restructuring of the presidency and the parliamentary system. But the main ones come down to enshrining uh, God in the Russian Constitution and a constitutional amendment saying marriage is between one man, one woman, getting rid of, gay marriage, of course, which that isn't in place. I don't know how that would apply to polygamy. I don't know what the situation is in the Muslim region of Russia, but that's a secondary concern to the gay marriage issue, which again is really sieging Eastern Europe as we see right now. And after all this, I don't know the exact day the vote is, but I know it's coming up soon. The U.S. Embassy in Russia. Can you guess what they did?
I mean, I can. Yes, I can guess. Would you like me to?
Go ahead.
They raised the gay flag.
Yeah, they unfurled their rainbow flag.
Wow, it's just like my high school. It's just like the high school I used to go to down the road.
So of course there's that, and I think if anything, if most Russians even realize it, I think it's going to do the opposite. I mean, I think it's going to have the opposite than intended effect.
Yeah.
I mean, what I mean, okay, you've been there recently. What are anti-American sentiments
Yeah.
like based on your experience just going there in the past year?
Well, okay. So I can say this. When I went there to basically, red pill them, like give them articles about, just a general kind of insanity that was really ramping up um, in the second half of Obama's term. Now, all the time I was dealt with faces that were completely puzzled. They couldn't believe it was true. This is made up. It's Photoshop. Are you kidding me? No way. None of that. Now, of course, last year was when I first noticed that they had become aware. So they would make jokes about, poo poo jokes, pee pee poo poo jokes about San Francisco. They were like right on it, and it was like, holy smokes, these guys caught up. They knew about the syringes and you know having trucks spray the sidewalks with water was actually racist. But all of it, they were so. I mean, with the people that I associated with. So in the years prior, they really weren't aware of it, and now they were. So support is like almost non-existent for gay marriage, uh, or I mean, let alone trans. I mean, that's just ridiculous to them. Or for instance, you see on Twitter, empathy for like virtuous pedophiles. They don't. There's just like zero tolerance for that.
Like those are the kind of people who are
So
beaten
no,
in the streets.
yeah, yeah, and also, I had a friend of mine. He left a message for me on Skype saying that TVs there they were running. This was, I guess, from May 29th to June 3rd, 4th. Really at the height of the protests and the looting and the arsonists and so on. They were just like leaving, channels that were just having like live streams, basically.
I remember that
Red pilling
Roughly
him
is an
with like,
RT affiliate.
yes, that's right. So he says, "Oh man, America's burning," and my friend it would joke with me, "Bro, did you join BLM?" so, so it was just hilarious. So yeah, they're more aware of it, and yeah, no, there's very little tolerance for this.
Yeah, so I
But
thought
yeah, that would it would just confirm like the U.S. embassy in Moscow raised the gay flag. It literally confirms for them everything that they know now.
yeah, and the one thing I do want to make clear, since I don't think I may have made it clear just a couple minutes ago, the vote is for the constitutional amendments like as a sweeping package, as the political and legislative reforms, as the role of religion in Russia, as the gay marriage thing. It's actually not a vote explicitly on gay marriage, and even if they voted it down, that wouldn't mean gay marriage is legal in Russia. It would just mean that the status quo is in case. But they're trying to enshrine it to the point where constitutionally it is barred. And I think I don't know how convincing the case is, whether they want to take that extra precaution. Now, if I have any Russian listeners out there, I would say, I learned this the hard way. A lot of Western nations learned this hard way. For that alone, I'd take the lickings with whatever contention you have with the political reforms. And personally, if I were a Russian, given the information I have, I would 100% be voting for this.
Yeah. Also, basically in the West, if you follow Western media, whether it's France 24 or CNN or whatever, BBC, the scaremongering is that this is a way for Putin to be in power till 2036. Do you know he'll be 83? He'll be even 1 year older than Biden. Think about that.
Well, you know that actually, fun fact: Francisco Franco died at age 83.
Yes. So most people in Russia don't believe that. that Putin is going to remain in power till 2036. I think primarily because Russia is on harder times than it was. It bounced back after Maidan very well. Now it's been tasked with new problems in 2020, especially due to COVID. So I know that Putin wants a legacy, but I think he's a very intelligent guy. So I think he wants a positive legacy. I'm very sure he's very wary about what kind of influence comes into Russia, and that he's going to play probably a very big role in the background. On the other hand, I think he knows that it can be detrimental if they don't see a new face in power.
Yeah,
That's my guess. I could be wrong, but that's the way I see things rolling out.
I think we also see him making these moves with the proposal of a constitutional amendment with the sacking of the entire government, and he reappointed a lot of people. Like the main two you would think are Lavrov and Shoigu are both in their traditional positions, and if you think about it, Shoigu did succeed him, very militaristic, very hawkish. He actually wanted war with Israel after the downing of the plane, but it would be the first time in 1,000 years that a Slavic nation was ruled by a Hapa warlord, but. uh,
You had to get that in.
I did. And it's almost something you want to see just for the meme of it all. But yeah, he's.
Oh, I would love it. If Lavrov. Oh my God, that would
no,
be so awesome.
I was talking about Shoigu. Yeah.
Shoigu. Yeah.
The Hapa warlord. But
yeah, that's right.
But I think Lavrov is probably, at least in terms of foreign policy, the best option with that. But again, time will tell. We'll probably see more figures come out of the running, or we could see one of the opposition parties take power. I mean, all things considered, the quote-unquote Liberal Democratic Party, which is Zhirinovsky's party, and the old Communist Party, they're actually pretty in line with what... I mean, you look at some of the things that passed the Russian parliament, they're almost all universal. I mean, the Russian Communist Party supported the anti-gay propaganda laws in 2013. It's a very odd situation, and don't be fooled by the names of these parties, since the Communist Party is not really communist, and the Liberal Democratic Party is not really liberal democratic. I mean, quite literally the only party with an accurate name is United Russia, and that's because their ideology is like, hey, let's just keep the peace, let's just keep things united. But point being is, I don't. Again, like people, like Western media will hype up Navalny. Oh, he's this great liberal guy who wants to modernize Russia. I mean, the guy has no popular support even among the distant parties in Russia. Come on. I mean, again, like the opposition to Putin is not this liberal. Look, there is a liberal democratic undercurrent in Russia, which, like in all nations, which is concerning, like in all nations. But the main oppositions are people nostalgic for the Soviet Union and people nostalgic for the Russian Empire, and a pretty large cross-section that are nostalgic for both, having lived under neither. It's a very odd political situation. I don't know how to quite describe it, but it's fascinating.
Communists, Tsarists, and Nazguls, basically.
Yeah, it's. I guess this is what a new political establishment looks like, and I doubt the West will ever be so lucky to have even a fraction of that. But with that out of the way, another Eastern European story I want to touch on before we move on to some of the stuff with Venezuela before closing all this out. Romania has joined the club with Poland and with Hungary, and they have banned gender studies within their country. They have really cracked down on that, which I think is a bit of a surprise considering Romania, it's an overlooked country, even in terms of the new power dynamic of Eastern Europe with the resurgent Russia. With you've heard a lot about Poland, you've heard a lot about Hungary, and that's because they've been making pretty significant moves, especially Hungary. But the Romanians, which I believe they're actually led by a centrist liberal party right now, actually took that step, and they defunded and removed gender studies and all these other sort of things from their educational institutions.
Yeah, and I expect to see more pivots. I know that Lavrov was visiting Serbia and was speaking to the Patriarch of Serbia to increase ties between their churches and to foment and push against Western liberal ideology. So
And
that's another
I
positive
imagine
that
Montenegro was
happened
a
last week.
I imagine Montenegro was a key focus of that.
Yeah, it wasn't mentioned, but I can guess they spoke a lot about it. So yeah, we're seeing this shift taking place in Eastern Europe, and it's funny because I think when I first started co-hosting the show with you, I mentioned that Eastern Europe was like kind of like another civilization. I know people will think like, no, they're what's going to save the West. I don't really believe that. I believe that they are different and that they actually have adopted Western civilization because it's the dominant civilization. And they've adopted their symbology, they've adopted their sign language. And part of that was just because they weren't strong, but I predicted that as the West becomes more unraveled and more chaotic, that they would start to um, go back to a more authentic self. And I think that's what we're seeing. I don't think it's like I think it's wrong to look at this as just another European nation that is going back to let's say more traditional roots. It's more significant than that.
Yeah, I think especially in the case of countries like maybe not so much Serbia, but Romania, especially with with the religious divide, a lot of the more Catholic Protestants, they're more likely to identify themselves with Western, such as Poland. But again, culturally, beyond like the religious aspects, right, it is a divide, and they're like you said, I think they're rediscovering their identity, which is again heavily influenced by the West. Even in the older times, even when the West was in this decrepit state, there was still a lot of Western influence in Eastern Europe. Don't get me wrong, but I think you make a good point that they're again rediscovering themselves in a time where the West has let them down, and I do think it has changed the opinion of a lot of Eastern European countries and a lot of Eastern European people on the dynamic between themselves, America and Russia, after the debacle in Ukraine, because they saw what happened in Ukraine. They saw, oh, we're going to rise up and become a pro-American country. They saw what America and the EU pushed in Ukraine. They also saw the Russians seize land there, and they start to rethink. Okay, yeah, the Russians they're an aggressive, they're a militaristic people, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to overrun us and have tanks on the border. I mean, those attitudes persist in the Baltic states and in Poland especially, but other parts of Eastern Europe, it may be there, but I would say it's definitely not as strong as it is in those countries. And then they saw America as this American foreign policy, especially as this driving force of social liberalism. Like, what is gender studies? What is transgenderism? I mean, how many? I mean, people ask like, well, ask an American 10 years ago if they've heard of these things. They haven't. Ask an Eastern European 5 years ago if they've heard of these things. I mean, you want sort of a perspective on that. Again, they've still had that shield of being, I would say, more isolated from the West on that, and I do think we are seeing something monumental there. I do think it may have some spillover into Western countries, but I do think it'll be primarily, if not exclusively, an Eastern European movement.
Right, right. And then you have some oddball countries, like people are aware how um, like how Russophile, Serbia is, and how long of a tradition they have with the Russians. Like in the battle of during the Napoleonic era, was it Borodino or Borodino? Of the 37 generals, 10 of them were Serbian. So this tradition goes back a long time. But then you have even countries like Slovakia, which were one of the first countries completely on board with Pan-Slavism. So they've been Russophiles for a very long time, and they're different in that regard with the Czechs.
Oh boy, yeah, the Czechs.
Who tend to be more Western, and even just 2, 3 years ago, of course, there were all these stories about right-wing groups in Slovakia that were being directly funded by by the Russian government and so on and so on. They can make cases like that because there is actually some truth to that, right? Uh, I mean, it's distorted, and this group may be nothing more than like five guys who drive motorcycles in the hills of Slovakia, but there is some background to
Yeah,
that, right?
or center right neoliberals who are slightly socially conservative and want a more cooperative relationship with Russia. Like that's usually what they mean by right wing groups backed by Russia in Europe. Now, I mean, I think it's a
Hmm.
good start. I think it's better than nothing, but don't be fooled. These people aren't exactly advocating for a return to monarchy or absolutism or
Yeah, yeah.
anything else that cool, I should say. But you brought it up, and one of the other things I wanted to touch on that I almost forgot about is Trump is mediating talks between Kosovo and Serbia, and that also coincides with Kosovo's "quote unquote" president being indicted for war crimes during the '99 war. And
Yes, this is a bit of a surprise. Go on.
uh, it like I was just gonna say that it is surprising. I think Trump is looking for a foreign policy victory because he stepped in Israel and Palestine. He thought he could get the Palestinians to agree to his lopsided agreement, which, again, he's tried multiple times. He thought he could broker peace in Korea, so he decided, what's the next contentious conflict after those two? The Balkans, and he stepped in there. And he's like, you know what? I'm gonna strike a deal between Kosovo and Serbia, and I'm gonna have my diplomatic victory, and it's gonna be a great peace deal, and it's gonna be the best. And ask anyone. And then, I just realized today what a towering man Vucic is. He's like what 6'8".
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'll be honest with you. This really caught me by surprise. I wonder what this is about because I mean you can make the argument that nothing's ever going to happen, that they're not really going to face a judge in The Hague or whatever, but it seems pretty serious, and I don't know if nothing is going to happen because Western media has been. It's not the leading story, and of course, in this time and place, it can't be. BLM and COVID are the leading stories. But for such a small country that nobody even knows where it is, they are quite serious about this. And so I wonder what this is about. Like, I wonder if, because there's basically 10 individuals involved, including their prime minister. Um, I think his name is Tatsi. I'm just trying to figure out.
Something like
Yeah,
that.
Tatsi, or is it Thatsi? It's Thci.
Come on,
There's
there has
one
to be at
other
least one
person.
Albanian out there that can help us with this. Just one. But continue.
It- it- yeah, so I do think they're serious about this. Um, Time will tell what happens. So yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. They certainly waited a long time to pursue him, so that would lead me to believe that there's something he's not doing that they want him to do. Could this be some kind of relationship that they want to smooth over with Serbia? Does it have to deal with the EU? Is that what it is? If they get Patsy's head on a stake, then you know Serbia will comply with something with the EU, uh, or is it something that's more directly related with the US? That's what I'm sort of thinking about.
I don't know, and I don't foresee this, but if Trump bailed from Kosovo, I would 100% vote for him. I would advocate him for him so much because, look, despite everything else, like if he could get us out of the Balkans, that would just number one, it would be hilarious to see the absolute the collapse of Bill Clinton's legacy in the Balkans and the while we're tearing down statues, can we tear down that Bill Clinton statue in Bill Clinton statue in Pristina? Thing's terrible. I hate it, but yeah, hopefully Serbia takes care of that. But joking aside, despite that, if America long shot did abandon the Kosovo project, it would be an incredible blow to the current liberal world order. This thing that we went to war multiple times for, we had multiple bombing campaigns for, we intervened ourselves in the Balkans, what, 3, 4 different times with the 90s, twice alone for Kosovo. If Trump somehow was allowed to bail from that, and given who his handlers are, and they're more concerned about the Middle East and Asia, like I said, I don't see it happening. I don't think it's likely, but if they were to ever let America bail from a foreign theater, the Balkans may just be it. And honestly, that would be an extreme blow. This fake state propped up by Western powers. Who else is going to step in? You think the British or the French are going to step in to support it? No, they hardly supported it in the first place. Yeah, they were behind Croatia, they were behind Bosnia, but Kosovo was mainly, again, the American project right there. So, if America
Mm-hmm.
does
Mm-hmm.
pull out, or even just cut support ever so slightly, I think it's a massive blow in credibility to the neoliberal narratives, especially considering the fact this was Bill Clinton's pet project. And honestly, if I had Trump's ear, I would sell him. And hey, do you want to destroy the Clinton legacy? Here's how you can do that. But again, I don't foresee that happening. But a man can dream now, can't he?
Yeah, I just want to add to this. It's a bit of an aside, but it's still Kosovo and Serbia. So there was a leak that has come out that I think it's in a recent book that's been published. You guys can look it up. So
Was it written by a certain former national security advisor?
no, no,
Oh, okay.
but it was someone close to the Clintons. So Hillary did not speak to Bill 8 months after the affair with Lewinsky became public. The first thing she said to him was to bomb Serbia.
No,
So
I'm just gonna propose this question to the audience. I know exactly what you're talking about. Have you ever simped so hard for a woman you had an affair on? Have you ever simped so hard that you bomb a
I
foreign
know.
country to create an illegitimate state? Look, despite whatever you may have done in life, despite whatever problems you may have had, I don't think you've ever degraded yourself that much. So
Yeah,
you can take solace in that. But
yeah.
with these last couple minutes here, I have to make a decision, and honestly, I think John Bolton's return to prominence is a bit more interesting than some of the Venezuela stuff, so I'm going to focus on that. And they kind of tie together, but
Mhm.
former National Security Advisor John Bolton, as I mentioned last week, has returned to the spotlight with his tell-all book on the Trump administration. Now, Trump, of course, is using um, uh, laws about national security and classification to withhold the book from being published. But that hasn't stopped John Bolton from going on the mainstream media talk show circuits, going on all these, you know, CNN, MSNBC, whatever. I think NBC News was the one that did the big interview with him, but he's making all these claims about the Trump administration. Like, Trump didn't want to support Guaido, who was the quote unquote legitimate president of Venezuela, because he didn't wear a wedding ring, and thought, yeah, he called him the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela. Um,
Oh my God.
he said, in reference to journalists, can we just execute them? Now, again, this is all alleged. This is all according to Bolton's personal account. So, how much of this is true, how much you want to believe it, I think that's up to you. Uh, he apparently begged Xi Jinping to help him win re-election, and
I
apparently,
gotta say, every time Trump pushes me away, he pulls me back in.
yeah, because a lot of these things I would say are semi-believable, and even though they're supposed to
Yeah,
damage Trump's credibility, like in the eyes of people like Bolton and the liberal establishment, again, this is the kind of stuff that won over a lot of people like us. It's just these ridiculous comments. Apparently, he also said he wanted to war in Venezuela because it would be quote unquote cool. So again, I think that one's probably a bit more outlandish, but I can believe him insulting Guaido. I can believe him talking about, can we just execute these journalists? I can just see him like in a moment of frustration, just like behind closed doors, just saying, "Oh, look, John, these people are insufferable. I just look. Can we just execute them?" I could see Trump going on like that kind of rant behind closed doors, and of course, Bolton, who was once hated by the Democratic activist class, who is now in the streets talking about queer racial justice or whatever the pet issue of today is. Talking about John Bolton, he lied us into a rock. He's one of Bush's worst attack dogs. He's great because Blumph is evil and he must be taken down. And Bolton also said he would not support Trump and he hoped he's one-term president, but refused to endorse Biden. So uh, maybe it's a maybe it's a Biden Bolton ticket we'll be getting.
I know what Bolton's going to do. He's going to go to the polls and he's going to look at the options between Biden and Trump, and then he's just going to write Netanyahu and do a check mark. That's it.
Cut out the middle, man. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, he's gonna be like wearing that little medallion he got for like a Defender Zion thing. He's gonna kiss it. He's gonna pat his chest where it is, and then he's gonna write in Netanyahu.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's remarkable. All these despicable people from the 2000s are suddenly legitimate because Orange Man bad, and not that he isn't bad, he is, but um, I just hate the flip that they've done. Like suddenly Bolton is legit. Mueller, who helped lie America into like its most disastrous war in Iraq, he's legit too. Like I mean, they made fake like worship candles out of him. It's just and of course George Bush Jr. Like it's just the most preposterous thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, it is wild the fact that and it's not just with this. Like they rehabilitated like Reagan under both the Bushes. They do this with the previous Republican president all the time, but they're really going into overdrive this time because Trump just rhetorically is that insufferable for them. And honestly, like I said before, I don't know what I'm going to do with this upcoming election because I'm trying to weigh, okay, well, who's the more chaotic candidate? But just still the visceral reaction a lot of these people have to Trump, I think is probably one of the best cases you could make from it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like all this. I mean, I've read some of the excerpts from the book, and uh, very carefully worded language about it doesn't ever call it an American empire, but he couches it in security, and everything is security. Like
And
the whole
the,
planet is
the
security.
world order and like
Yes.
American values and American security, like yeah, like again, so all these things that could be just streamlined if we admit we were an empire.
Yeah, yeah. But I do think it's kind of maybe he's extra mad because all those 5 Iranian ships with oil made it to Venezuela. I don't know.
Yeah,
And Blumf just let it happen.
yeah, yeah. He was interestingly enough. No criticism of like Trump's conduct with Russia or anything like that. I wonder if that's just because it's a dead issue that won't bring much traction, or again, or maybe he was actually satisfied with Trump's conduct on Russia. Who knows?
Hmm.
Which actually judging, I think he may have been satisfied. I mean, it was under him we scrapped the INF. It was under him we scrapped a lot of arms treaties, which again are currently in negotiations right now. We'll probably pick up on that next week because we don't have a lot
Yeah.
of the details beyond the fact that China actively refused to participate, and then there were comments from the American leader of the American delegation. But again, that's all stuff for next week. But like I said, surprisingly absent. At least I haven't seen it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just missed it. Bolton didn't criticize Trump's foreign policy towards Russia, so I think
Hmm.
that's a bit odd. That's a bit telling. Or like I said, it could just be opportunistic where they don't really care about the Russia issue anymore. But that's all I had for this week.
Yeah, that's all I have.
And we're clocking in about an hour 28, so we'll see you guys actually in a few hours here. This thing's going to be premiering, so it's going to be,
Oh, nice.
yeah, just this afternoon. I suppose that would have been more convenient to tell you at the beginning of the episode before just leaving you hanging with this, but what are you going to do? So we'll see you guys next episode, and goodbye.
Goodbye.